Intel has released a new GPU. Every big YouTube channel seems to love the B580 as a kind of budget choice, but is it any good for Star Citizen? Well, the answer to that is a little mixed. We're going to be comparing it to the 4060, 3060, the 6700 XT and the 7600 at 1080p and 1440p, and there are lots of very interesting things to observe about how these cards are performing. VRAM usage does seem to be going up on the whole, and we're seeing both the AMD and Nvidia cards affected. I've done a load of Vulkan testing, so that's pretty interesting. And we've also got some resizable bar numbers and testing of PCIe Gen 3 versus Gen 4 for the B580. All the test setup and all the details are in the description, but first let's start with Area 18. Now, you'll see that the 4080 here is used as our kind of control number. That's basically maxing out the 9800 X3D, and this is at 1080p. You see the 6700 XT is pretty close to that, but the B580 is kind of middle of the pack here of all these cards. Now, the thing to observe here is, and this is the interesting thing that I'm seeing that's relevant to basically everybody with graphics cards, is the impact of VRAM. So the 3060 does have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and if you look at its 1% percentile FPS, it is significantly better than the 4060, which is a faster card but only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, the 7600 also has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and over the years we've seen big issues with AMD cards that just can't cope when they run out of VRAM, and that's kind of why I've really only recommended the 6700 XT as kind of a minimum, because that's got 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so plenty. If we look at a frame time graph for the 3060 versus the 4060, 3060 on top, you'll see that generally we're getting much smoother performance, and obviously there's still a good spike on the 3060 graph, but this is Star Citizen after all. My suspicion is that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is starting to not be enough for Star Citizen. In general, all across the different testing I've done here today, I've seen the similar sort of pattern. The 3060's 1% percentile lows and just general smoothness is better than the 4060. And like I said, we've seen this significantly with AMD cards in the past. If we look at the Intel B580 here on top versus the 760 on the bottom, you see the 760 is very spiky. But you will also notice that the Intel card does have probably more spikes, those bigger spikes, and that again is going to be something we're going to see throughout this testing. Let's keep going. In a lot of reviews out there, we were seeing that the B580 was quite strong at 1440p. We've actually seen here that the 4060 has jumped slightly ahead, but effectively everything falls kind of where you'd expect it. The 6700 XT is a bit further out in front, and again the 3060 is ahead of the 4060 in terms of those 1% percentile lows. On the Horizon roof, we're testing the clouds now at 1080p. Actually, from the 4080 upwards, we're all actually on the CPU, so those results aren't really that relevant. It's only the 3060 and the 7600 that can't max out the 9800 X3D at this point. But at 1440p, we see something much more interesting, and we've actually also got some very high cloud data here as well. So I've pop them in the same graph so you can compare. You can see that the 4080 doesn't make any difference if you've got medium clouds or very high clouds. It's powerful enough at 1440p to run both of those. And then you'll see the 6700 XT is out in front again here. Again, the 4060 and the B580 are kind of neck and neck. But as we move to very high clouds, you can see that actually the B580 jumps ahead a bit here. And so we're talking things like GPU architectures and how they're all slightly better at certain different things. It might be here that the B580 is better when you push the clouds really high, but it's not really something I would recommend. Again, most people probably want to leave the clouds on medium. Into quantum travel, which is quite a clean way to test graphics card performance because there's not really much going on for the CPU, just the graphical effects. And you can see here, the 4080 is way out in front at 1080p. The B580 actually is doing well here, and you'll notice that the 6700 XT has probably got its worst result. Again, this is something we're seeing consistently with this generation of AMD cards. They don't do quantum travel quite as well as other cards, so they tend to drop down, but it's nothing shocking. And at 1440p, the B580 is doing well again here. Probably the thing to note from all of this is that none of these cards really you'd want to play at 1440p without turning upscaling on, which probably again would be something you'd recommend for pretty much everybody. Now let's get into a load of testing done in Lawville. First of all, 1080p, you can see that it kind of, again, everything's kind of where you'd expect. The 6700 XT is slightly out in front. Again, look to the 1% percentile lows for the 3060 versus the 4060. Again, 3060, although slower, does provide a smoother experience in some ways than the newer and faster NVIDIA card because it's got those 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Here is the frame time graph for the Intel card. And again, you'll notice there are a fair few spikes. And this is something that I saw everywhere that I tested with this card. Just out of nowhere, at random points, there'd just be a bit of a stutter. And initially, when you load into the game for the first time with this card, when you first installed it, the compilation of the shaders, which is something that all cards have to deal with when they're freshly installed, it seems to be pretty impactful for the Intel card, more so than AMD or Intel. You get a lot of stutter, like a lot of stutter. And it's hard to tell whether at various points the card there's still stuff with the shaders going on, and maybe that's causing some of these spikes. Really hard to know, but there are just general occasional spikes when you're playing with this card, which is why, although the performance is pretty good and the price is pretty good, it makes it pretty hard at this point to recommend it. Drivers, Intel stuff, we'll talk about that in a second, but let's keep going for a minute with the 1440p results. Again, probably none of these cards are really fast enough to run at 1440p. Maybe, depending on your CPU, you might say it's worth upping your graphics to make everything look a bit better if you've not got a really fast CPU, but you are losing quite a bit of performance compared to 1080p. Let's quickly talk about PCIe Gen 4 versus Gen 3, because this is something I've looked at before on the channel, and it's probably, we don't want to go too deep into it, but if you're looking at these graphs here, you see that if you are running at 1080p, you do lose a bit of performance if your motherboard would only support PCIe Gen 3. And that's because this card, like quite a few low-end offerings from AMD and NVIDIA, is only an 8-lane card. It's not using the full 16 lanes that often GPUs do. When you're running on Gen 4, that's not an issue. But when you are running on Gen 3, you do lose performance. And at 1440p, basically it's looking the same. Performance has dropped a little bit, especially on 1% percentile lows, but that doesn't show the full picture. The first run that I did, I couldn't actually complete because the Lawful train didn't turn up, but performance was completely on the floor. We were talking sub 10 FPS, and why exactly that was, I don't know, but I would steer clear of cards like this that are PCIe Gen 4 times 8 if you are only on a motherboard that supports PCIe Gen 3. Another thing to talk about with this Intel card, and it was a big deal when these first Intel cards came out a couple of years ago, was the reliance basically on resizable bar. Again, we're not going to go too deep into what that is, but it's an option in the motherboard. Yeah, you turn it on basically and forget in most cases, but you do definitely want to turn it on in this case, because without it, performance is horrific. So you can see here a massive drop in performance. Completely, everything was all over the place. And I'll show you the frame time graph is a complete mess, and those spikes go a lot higher than 200 milliseconds. But yeah, it's not great. And at 1440p, again, huge drop in performance. So these cards have to have resizable bar and 4G encoding, above 4G encoding turned on. Now, Vulkan is a very interesting topic in Star Citizen, something we've been looking forward to and hoping would help with performance, and in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. This is quite a good time to re-look at it just before we go into 4.0. So this basically is the state of where things are at in 3.24.3. You will see the 4080, as you might expect, is at the top, but you do lose performance once you put Vulkan on, but you do, as we've seen in the past, improve your 1% percentile FPS. So things in general are smoother, but you are losing your overall average FPS. As we go down this graph, you'll see that the B580, well, there is no Vulkan result, and that's because this just crashes. The Intel card just completely crashes whenever you try to load in game with Vulkan on. I've tried this multiple times, tried it in Arena Commander. It just doesn't work at all. And we mentioned the idea of Intel drivers, and this was when they've released their first GPUs. A big issue is that for some games, things just didn't really work very well. There was an immaturity to the Intel drivers. Things have improved, I think, a lot. Again, if you looked at the main YouTube big reviews on this, most people were saying this is working pretty well. There were examples of games that just didn't either work at all or there were problems. And the fact that this is not working with Vulkan, is that on CIG or is that on Intel? I don't know. Whether there's enough Intel users playing Star Citizen for either CIG or Intel to look into this and try and fix things, that would be my fear. My fear would be that it's not a high priority because there won't be a lot of people using this card in Star Citizen. So I don't know whether Intel will care to try and make the game work, and I don't know whether CIG will have that near the top of their priority list. So that is the fear, and again, one of the reasons where I probably would steer clear of this. But getting back to the Vulkan stuff, you'll notice that the only example where things suddenly are dramatically better overall average FPS wise is the 7600, because when you've turned Vulkan on, actually average is up and 1% percentile FPS is also up. My suspicion, as it's always been, is that Vulkan manages the memory better than DX11 for these AMD cards, and so we don't see the crazy drops and stutters that we see with DX11. But that's the only example where things get better as an average FPS. And just to highlight how this works with the NVIDIA cards, here's the 4060. You can see that with DX11, there's, like we saw before, the general kind of spikiness, but under Vulkan, things look a lot better. And again, is that down to the fact that even though this card's got 8 GB of VRAM, that under Vulkan things are managed better? That is my guess. And at 1440p, we see effectively the same story. Things generally perform smoother, but the overall average is down when you're using Vulkan. Vulkan, on the whole, is going to be interesting to see how it develops. This is a good kind of snapshot with 3.23.4. Will things dramatically improve with 4.0? I will retest a load of stuff and we'll get a video out for that at some point. Let's though focus now on the B580 and kind of sum this all up. I'll put some footage up from the PTU 4.0 and you'll see that there are these moments of just stutters where things just stutters. Is this down to VRAM? Shouldn't be, because it's got 12 gigabytes. VRAM could be to do with bandwidth of the VRAM. There's all sorts of things. My suspicion is it's just driver stuff. And as I said before, are Intel or CIG going to invest any time into fixing this in Star Citizen? I am unsure of that, and that's why I just don't think this would be a card I'd recommend at this point, even at the price point that it's at, because $250, wherever it is in your price, in your area, it's a good price, but for my money, I would choose the 6700 XT every day of the week over this, because even though it costs more, performance is generally better, and it's just not suffering from these spikes in the same way, and obviously it works at least with Vulkan. So I'm going to keep this card because it's interesting, and hopefully over time things will just improve. But at this point, I just wouldn't choose this card in any way.